Okay, and welcome back to a new episode of Yogis on the Road. This is Giuseppe. I'm with Alexis and our teacher, Guy Donahaye.
Hello.
And today we wanted to maybe dig a little bit into your personal experience, Guy, and see, for example, because I've been reading your book. And that's about like interviewing, yoga masters, and it's been quite a few years since you did that. And now you're on the other side of the mic, right? So you're being interviewed now, and you're the yoga master. And what has changed? What is the difference in your perception of yoga in the past 20 years? What has been going on? How do you see it?
Well, maybe I'll just start about speaking about how I came to yoga in the first place.
Yeah.
There is a central theme in yoga practice, which is, who am I? And that's a question I've been asking myself a very long time. When I was very young, as a child, I think I was very fortunate to have had the experience of being in a beautiful natural environment, and also having parents who were also on the yogic path. And so, in a certain sense, I had a very ideal childhood. We ate organic food, biodynamic food. We were mostly vegetarian. My parents were, on the path of realization, meditating, following the yama, niyama. It was not an Eastern yogic path, but very much in line with it. And I used to spend so much time out in nature, playing in the river, climbing trees, running in the forest, etc. And I had a lot of energy, and I was very happy, extremely happy. Even to the extent that I think sometimes I was experiencing possibly some kind of samadhi. I felt no kind of boundary between my own mind and what was going on around me. So nature seemed to kind of penetrate my mind, enter my dreams. My dreams seemed to enter reality. And I think a lot of children have some of these kinds of experiences. I think I was just particularly fortunate that, it was a totally kind of unconditioned environment. I wasn't exposed to city life or, harshness. And then around age 10, my intellect started to kind of develop, and I started to read my father's newspaper. And I started to read about, human atrocities, and war, famine, death, disasters, etc. And it came as a total shock to my system. I was very innocent and very open and joyful prior to that point. And it just came as a huge shock. And I started to ask adults, my parents and my teachers and so on, what is death? What happens after you die? Why is there suffering? Why can't I just play forever? Why can't I just enjoy my life? And I began to see that, I'd have to get a job, and I'd have to, get involved in this whole rat race, this whole misery of life. And unfortunately, no one could really give me the kind of answers I was looking for. I mean, perhaps it's partly because I was extremely upset, so I probably wouldn't hear it anyway. But I felt the kind of answers I was getting were book answers. They weren't lived, experienced. This is what happens after you die, things like that. I was getting the textual responses, and that just made me even more depressed and angry. And it was almost as though overnight those beautiful experiences I was having in nature, those blissful experiences just disappeared. And so it was a huge kind of loss and feeling of suffering at that moment. And it was the beginning of my search for meaning, like, why? What's going on, you know? I began to experience a different kind of reality, you know. It seemed kind of grey and miserable and dark. And in comparison to what I'd experienced previously, it seemed much less real. So perhaps what I experienced was something more subjective previously. I don't know. But it was much more vital, much more impressed itself on me with so much more intensity, and it felt so much more real. And at the same time, I was observing other kids were having similar types of experiences, maybe not so blissful, but they had this vitality, they had this energy. And I observed that as people got older and older, they became less and less vital. They became more and more jaded. They became more and more speaking out of not direct experience, but out of what they'd decided the answer was, or what they'd read, or without even really thinking about it. So my perception was that, you know, this vitality sort of continued up until the end of the teens, and then by the end of the 20s, people were basically brain dead, as far as I was concerned. I thought people were just totally lacking in imagination or vitality or life, basically. And I just got really depressed about it. And so I guess since that time, it's been a path of trying to rediscover that experience that I had at that time, and it started just through studying and reading. And initially I started, because I couldn't get the answers from my elders, I started reading science. So I started reading, I thought perhaps science could give me the answers.
How old were you?
It's around 10, 11 years old.
That's when you were reading about science?
That's when I started.
So you had, at 10, observed the decay of human maturity up into the 30s and made those conclusions?
I can't say it exactly
like
happened
adults.
At age 10, but as I was asking these questions and getting the answers, which seemed to be so
conditioned,
exactly, then I started observing around me other kids, and then recognizing that teenagers still had something of that, you know. Basically, how do you respond to new experience? You respond with a kind of wonder, a kind of like joy, and you know,
curiosity.
Awe, exactly. And then once you know everything, you know, you just kind of get dull. You know. And I even sort of felt that, God, I wouldn't even want to live beyond 30. People are just so, you know, so depressing. I definitely wouldn't want to bring children into this world, into this kind of, you know. And maybe it's because I had this kind of such contrast prior to that, you know, having such beautiful experience as a young child, that it really impressed me so strongly. But I noticed it also with my own daughter when she was around age 10 or 11. There was a moment where she was looking at getting older and thinking, oh my God, that's really depressing. I wish I could just stay a kid for the rest of my life. And then at a certain point, she was like, bring it on, you know, like, I just want to be adult, get me out of here, you know. So I suspect that many people have a similar kind of experience, maybe not as dramatic as I had at that point. Anyway, so I started searching, and my first sort of the first place I looked was to science, because I felt that, you know, science was professing to give us the answers to everything. So I started reading everything I could. I read the encyclopedia from front to back, and I was a very curious kid, and so I, you know, was just exploring all these things. And initially it really kind of fascinated me, but after a little while I began to realize that science also didn't have the answers. You know, when you first start reading about these things, you get very simple explanations. You know, for instance, gravity is the force of 10 meters per second that works on an object. A little bit later on, you're told, oh, it's actually 9.81 meters per second. A little bit later, you understand, oh, there's this theory of relativity that affects gravity. Oh, there's a theory of special relativity. And actually, gravity doesn't work. Those laws of gravity don't work in all cases. There's no theory which connects what happens on the quantum level between bodies and things that happened in the macro world. And so I began to realize that science also was just constantly sort of putting forward paradigms which were being overthrown. And actually, since the beginning of the 20th century, there have been no new laws of science have been discovered. There are only theorems. So I also became disillusioned with science. And I guess by that time I was becoming a teenager, and wasn't really quite so rational anymore. Was getting more emotional, getting more sort of
tortured.
And somehow I started to find my way to reading sort of existentialist philosophy and nihilism and Nietzsche and Albert Camus and so on. And very soon after that also was the kind of whole punk explosion.
Yeah,
that also coincided. Well, prior to that, Sex Pistols and et cetera, et cetera.
Sex Pistols and Sartre.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so that was kind of the progression. And then I guess, from looking for the answer through science, through getting disillusioned even more, and then sex and drugs and rock and roll, teenage years, which also kind of played into that kind of nihilistic feeling.
Yeah.
And the feeling that, I didn't really want to live beyond my 30th year and, just try and destroy the body and enjoy myself in the meantime. And of course, after a little while, my body started to totally break down and I started to get sick. And at a certain point, I got really quite sick.
How old were you?
Well, this really happened in my mid-20s, mid to late 20s.
Okay.
And in the meantime, I'd also started reading more kind of yogic type philosophy. My grandma had given me a couple of books in my mid-teens. One book about Sai Baba, another book, The Quest for the Overself by Paul Brunton, which I later discovered was written in the Maharaja's summer palace, Maharaja of Mysore's summer palace, which is where I ended up spending, going back annually for 30 years or so. And I also started to read Buddhism, Taoism. She was quite an interesting character, was quite influential on me. She was totally into the occult and magic and was having, she said she was having all kinds of clairvoyant and mystical kinds of experiences herself, researching life after death. So she was a sort of an influence there, and I started reading about all this stuff, and then I started becoming fascinated with meditation.
As you were sick?
Before I got sick,
Okay.
But if I couldn't, because I was drinking and taking drugs and, treating my body really badly, I found that meditation just really wasn't happening at all. And then when I was 24, a kind of magical event happened, which was I became a dad. And that totally shifted my perspective. I suddenly realized I'm not sure if I wanted to live longer, but I suddenly had the feeling I've got a duty now.
Yeah.
I've got responsibilities, and I've got to take care of myself and think differently. And around that time was also when all these bad habits were beginning to have a negative health impact. And at a certain point, I just got really sick. And had to give everything up.
You weren't practicing, you hadn't discovered yoga
I had
at this
not
time?
discovered. I had read about yoga. I had read a lot of sort of Eastern philosophy, Buddhism, and books about it. But I read the Gita and some other books, but I hadn't come across actual asana practice at this point. But I realized that in order for me to heal and to recover, I needed to find a modality. And I was exploring different things. I was looking into martial arts or, and I also felt at this point that I was looking for a comprehensive practice which would help me to find healing, but also could be a kind of life practice and maybe a profession.
Yeah.
Because I was a very bad employee. Had, very little respect for authority, as most of us did at that time. This whole punk movement was just a total rejection of everything that came before, and anarchy, and so I was a really bad employee. I was a really kind of a square peg in a round hole, as the saying goes. So somebody just kind of said, "Hey, you got to meet this guy. He teaches yoga. He lives in the next village from you, and check it out." And it happened to be teaching Ashtanga yoga. So for my very first yoga class, I did a full primary series with him, and I was kind of hooked from there.
What was it that hooked you?
Well, I just felt totally amazing after the practice. I was buzzing. I was, I'd always been very athletic. And I just kind of lay down Shavasana after the practice, and my whole body was just tingling. I felt, after being sick, for a number of years, I felt a huge vitality, energy, and I was kind of fascinated by it. I wanted to explore it and go deeper. I tried all the poses, even though I hadn't really been doing any stretching exercise, Kurmasana, Baddha-Konasana. I mean, it was a bit of a disaster, but I felt the depth of those stretches and what they could potentially do. And I just only took one class, and then he gave me some information, a few books to read. He gave me suggested BKS Iyengar's Light on Yoga. Told me to read the Yoga Sutra. He showed me how to cook yogic food. He actually took me back to his home.
What a nice teacher.
Yeah, it was really very comprehensive introduction. So I learned how to make rice and dal and, cook, look after myself in a wholesome way.
What years are we on now?
Well, this happened
early 90s?
Age
80s.
Age 28, so 1991 was when I first started practicing yoga.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because I keep thinking about this, and then I keep on thinking, would this ever happen in New York in 2020? And your teacher comes and shows you how to make yogic food and all this.
Well, we've done this before.
Changed. Yeah.
No, we used to do this kind of thing, cooking workshops and stuff like
cool.
that. Cooking for the students. Yeah. Yeah. No, I see food as a very essential,
as part of it,
very essential part of yoga, but also for me, it was a very essential part of my healing at that time. Because I was, totally indiscriminate with my eating habits and drinking habits and, drugs and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And so I really needed to make a change in the way I was looking after my body. Yeah, so that was actually, interestingly, it was 28 and a half years ago. And about a couple of weeks ago, I just turned 57, which is 28 and a half years later. So right now, I've been practicing yoga for half my life, exactly half my life.
Wow.
That's one orbit of Saturn around the sun.
Exactly. So I arrived in Mysore on my Saturn return. Exactly on my Saturn return.
And now you're having another child.
And now I'm having my third child, so yeah. Even though I thought that maybe that phase was over, I'm now reestablishing that whole being in society, being in the family way for the next period of Saturn, which is another 29 years.
Yeah.
Why
the
not?
Planet
I
of
mean-
the Guru.
Yeah. No, I thought I'd be going off to the cave, but it seems
Well,
not yet.
life had other plans for me.
Yeah, I mean, you called it a magical experience having a child. Maybe it is like a cave in the sense you get to face the unconditioned mind.
Yeah, there is that. I think for me, what it was I was so absorbed in my own ego, in my own experience, and didn't really have much compassion or feeling for others. I think I was just very wound up with my own misery, or coming from my own misery. And then when you have this innocent, vulnerable creature that you have responsibility for, it totally shifts your perspective. You have something very important to take care of, and you can. I think also part of the getting really sick was a sort of ego destruction for me as well. It's like total physical, psychological, emotional crash. I had like a midlife crisis in my mid-20s, and everything got reset at that point as I started then to go to India and practice yoga.
But it's cool because just like every crisis, it can be like an opportunity for you to like change completely and
Absolutely.
positive,
Absolutely.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, very often you just don't see the signs until, you just get hit over the head with a hammer,
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, some people are perhaps a little bit more perceptive, but for me, it required quite a big shock to change my behavior. And,
I read it in
to wake up.
Yeah, I read it in this book. It was like life will keep on like giving you signs until you get it, and like the more you ignore it, the more impact.
Right,
and
the bigger the sign.
Yeah, exactly.
Eventually going to get hit over the head with the sign.
It's
You
like,
can't
okay,
read it.
can't miss it.
Yeah, that's what happened to me. Yeah.
Isn't it interesting though that like, for example, like what you could experience as a child, that sort of feeling of, let's say, samadhi, and being one with nature and all that. And then it takes like a whole lifetime of like research and working on yourself and all this to just get back to that experience that a child can naturally have because it's unbiased. But then you use your mind and your knowledge and you work on your body and spirituality and all that just to go back to something
it
that
took
could be
took a lot longer. I mean, it didn't like immediately go to Mysore and suddenly, the light bulb went on and suddenly everything was better. No, it actually took me a few decades to come back to that sort of experience again. I often joke with students that for each year of your life you practice yoga, you get younger by a year.
Oh, yeah.
So by my own calculation, I got back to about year 0.
Congratulations.
But having said that, it really took quite a while for yoga to get properly established in me. So, it was not really working for me in the best possible way. So I don't think I quite got back to the year 0. Maybe I got back to about age 10. Which is like,
Yeah.
That's what I was aiming for.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, basic question time of the show. Are those the same? Like the experience of, let's say, quote unquote, samadhi of a child versus of an adult now, 57 years old, with all that you've gone through and all the studies and everything. Are those experiences of like, I don't even know how to describe it. Let's say the oneness. Are those the same, or are they? How do they differ if they do?
Well, all the studies are basically telling you or helping you to understand what it's not. What it is a kind of uncovering of something which is below the functioning of the mind. And like I say, it didn't just hit me right away. It took actually a couple more decades And I think it probably had less to do with practice. I sort of forgot what I was looking for. When I came to yoga practice and started practicing asanas, Pattabhi Jois used to say, forget about meditation, just do your asana practice. It may take you a couple of decades to purify your body and your mind, and then maybe you can think about sitting and the rest of the blah, blah, blah. So I kind of surrendered to that agenda for a while and recognized that there was not really a huge amount of progress happening. I think in the early years, I certainly got physically healthy, and I think a big part of that is the change of lifestyle. It has less to do with asana practice. I think we spoke about this previously, how, asana practice, the kind of ambition in asana practice gives you motivation to change your lifestyle, because you can't do those poses unless you're eating well, unless you're digesting well, unless you're sleeping at the right time, etc., etc. So I think the major changes that happened for me in the early years through asana practice were indirect. They were not actually. Asana practice definitely did help. Many of those poses are kind of deeply therapeutic for the digestive system. For instance, sticking the heel in the stomach and twisting and rinsing out your liver and all this kind of thing. That definitely is therapeutic. But the major changes happen through diet, in my opinion. I think food is one of the biggest factors in changing the way you experience your mind and body. And I also felt kind of stuck for big parts of the next decade or so, decade or two, in terms of my spiritual growth. At a certain point, I discovered nature photography. And, I'd always been interested in photography, but when I went off to India in my 20s, I sold everything that I had, including my SLR film camera. And I basically gave away all my possessions, or sold my possessions, and wanted to become a yogi and go sit in a cave or something, which didn't really work for me. But anyway, I gave up my camera, and then it took until about 10 years ago when digital SLRs suddenly became affordable, and I bought one and started to do some landscape photography. And progressively over the next decade or so, I went out more and more often from the city out into nature and was doing photography, and I was searching all these different locations. And my obsession was to photograph nature without any evidence of any human impingement on the landscape. Because that's actually what I had experienced as a child. I experienced this kind of pristine, pure nature. And my observations over the subsequent decades was that this is getting destroyed progressively by, building roads and etc. And one of the most, fantastic things about America is the incredible landscapes which have been preserved. You've got hundreds of square miles of just perfect, beautiful landscapes. So I started leaving the city actually more and more frequently to go on these photo trips, and I planned them. And without realizing it, I started to really enjoy and feeling peace and bliss being out in nature again. And so it kind of brought me a full circle.
Yeah.
That's not the only factor. Another factor is, of course, meeting my teacher, not Pattabhi Jois, but my other teacher, who really helped me to understand properly the context of practice. And it took me quite a while of practicing the Ashtanga method of Pattabhi Jois to sort of let go a little bit of that agenda of, trying to progress through the body, through the asanas, so that you could earn the right to do the pranayamas and et cetera, et cetera. There was this very linear type of progression that was being put forward as a way to, evolve in yoga practice. And it really took me quite some time to let go of that and to absorb and understand my other teachers' teachings and begin to experience yoga, really what yoga was,
Nice.
How old were you when you met your next teacher?
Well, actually, we met a couple of years after I arrived in Mysore. So I arrived in Mysore in 91, and I think in 93 I first met him. But
so you started in that city in 91, and then you went to Mysore almost immediately after?
Yeah, about 6 months later.
Okay.
Yeah, I was really on a
Fast.
kind of... Yeah, no, I was on a... I was desperate, you know, and I wanted to go deep, and I wanted, you know...
Dedicated student.
Yeah, I don't know about dedicated student, but desperate, you know, and fascinated, you know. It's kind of my nature, is to be a bit extreme.
Go
and
hard.
So, you know, yoga practice it's taken a while for me to learn how to soften and, not go to those extremes. Pattabhi Jois didn't really help me, you know.
Yeah.
He was like...
Yeah, Ashtanga can be quite extreme sometimes.
He was pushing back, I was pushing, he was pushing back, you know. It was like a bit of a tug of war in a way. Yeah, so I met my other teacher soon after I met Pattabhi Jois. Initially, I, you know, kind of totally surrendered to Pattabhi Jois's method. Really kind of gave it the benefit of the doubt, and actually, not just initially, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. But after a couple of years, I began to realize that he was not really... He was not a Satguru. You know? I found in the way he treated me.
What was your life like? Like at that point, you know, how long would you stay in India, and how did you manage that?
Typically, I'd stay in India 3, 4, 5 months and then go back, and I was kind of living a bit like a hippie, kind of working, living cheap, and then, you know, going back to India for the first 2-3 years. I taught a little bit starting in 93, but that didn't really generate very much income. And then actually after my first 3 trips to India, I decided to see if not practicing would make any difference. I went through 3 years, 3 trips to India, got through the intermediate series during that time. And then I was just curious to see how I'd feel if I didn't practice. And interestingly enough, I didn't really feel much different.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was, I mean, I think what I learned in the practice in those first 3 years, and it wasn't just through asana, it was really, you know, engaging with Pattabhi Jois was a psychological experience as well. It was not just a physical experience, it was psychological. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean that, there were negatives, definitely. It was interesting, you know, my body was really, I had a lot of injuries, and it was pretty toxic at the time. And I had a lot of pain in the practice, and I got injured by him repeatedly. But there was this sort of narrative that, and it was coming from him also, like pain is due to impurities in your body, impurities in your mind, and just practice, and, you know, eventually you'll get purified and the pain will go away. But, you know, the pain was caused by his adjustments, actually, and the intensity of practice and my own intensity. You know, I was also a very intense person. So I was using it to kind of beat myself up. But at the same time, after I got injured, my first injury came after just 3 weeks with him. He blew my knee out in Marichastadi, and I couldn't walk, and he actually tore the meniscus, and I was kind of pretty traumatized. And he said, you know, come back, you got to come back, don't leave, you got to come back. And I was like about to leave Mysore, but I'd invested and sold all my possessions, and I was totally invested in this trip to Mysore. I'd given everything for it. And so I trusted him, and I continued to practice with him. And each day we came to that pose, and he said, trust me, relax, and breathe. And he'd put me in the pose very deep. I wouldn't feel any pain. I totally surrendered. And within 10 days, it was like my knee was cured. So it was kind of a magical experience with him.
About trust,
Well, I felt him as a healer initially at that point, but also about surrender and trust and breathing, and those simple principles which I learned from him at that time are ones which I absolutely use
Yeah.
today as a teacher. And, I don't force students strongly into poses. I don't try and avoid causing any pain whatsoever. But those are still very basic, simple principles which I remind students about to help them to feel okay in the present moment when they feel anxiety or when they feel pain, So it was a very valuable lesson. And I thought, he's healed me. But then, as soon as he healed my knee, then, he totally blew out my hip in Baddha-Konasana, and I couldn't walk for 2 years.
For 2 years?
Yeah. I mean, I could walk, of course, but I couldn't walk without pain. He totally ripped open my left hip. It's a huge crunch, and both of them were just big crunches. And, I just kind of swallowed this idea that, I'm not worthy. My body is impure, my mind is impure, it's my responsibility, that I'm pain, and I totally bought this kind of narrative.
It's sort of like maybe
it's all my fault,
Yeah. Did that sort of like was feeding on like maybe how you felt as a teenager and like all those negative thoughts, and was that appealing to that part of you, maybe, of your story?
I don't think I ever really hated myself, as a teenager. I hated everybody else. I was very, disparaging, dismissive of what I saw outside of myself. I thought I was okay myself, even though I was having a lot of intense emotional experiences, anxiety and anger and, intensity. No, this was a new
Feeling?
Acceptance of a new way of being, going to India. And it wasn't just with Pattabhi Choice, it was being in the whole environment of the Indian way of acceptance of, all cultures flow into Hinduism, everything just gets absorbed in this kind of beautiful way, there's a timelessness, there's a real beauty. And I think, for a lot of us, just being in India was the huge learning part of the yoga, not being in the asana room. It was just being in India. That was very important. And I really it actually took me a couple of decades to really, and in fact more than a couple of decades, it really took me until 2 or 3 years ago to recognize the self-delusion that I'd put myself in the asana room at that time. It was only when I started listening to Karen Rain's talk about the sexual abuse, which we sort of, at the time, we just kind of, well, we'll go into this in some depth later, I'm sure. But we kind of looked the other way. We just kind of accepted that he was touching people, what we'd considered inappropriately. We found ways to justify that behavior. In the same way, I found ways to justify his injuring me and accept it and believe that I was the one who was not good enough. I was the one who had the pain in my body. And eventually, if I kept on practicing, everything would be okay. And of course it wasn't. I kept having pain, continued to have pain for decades. But it was only when I...
How did you make the switch?
Well, it was when I started reading her testimony and thinking, like, why did she stay? Why did she stay in Mysore if she was being sexually assaulted? And then I thought, well, I was horribly injured and I stayed. And I started to tell the story, after I got injured. Instead of saying, I got injured, I used to say, I had this great experience with Pattabhi Jois. He healed me. So instead of talking about my injury, I talked about how amazing it was that he healed me from my injury. So I put a new spin on that story. And only when I really started to listen to these women talking about their experience of being sexually abused by him, the fact that he was sexually abusing them, that I began to think about my own experiences differently and began to realize that I had also, between us, all the students together, we all said, we all used to talk about, it's not an injury, it's an opening. And of course, I was also invested in being a teacher and maintaining that narrative, because that was my income, my livelihood. So it became quite a complex.
But is there an actual fine line between like an injuring and an opening, or no?
Maybe. I think opening probably shouldn't have. There shouldn't be any pain there. Probably.
Okay.
I mean, another thing Pattabhi Joy saw, as you say, sweet pain. What is sweet pain? Well, yeah, when you're stretching or whatever and your body feels like it. But sweet pain is not when your knee is blown out and you've torn your meniscus, or you can't walk for 2 years because, he's injured you in Baddha Konasana. That's not sweet pain. Absolutely not. Even if you're getting some kind of sweetness from practice, it's still not sweet pain.
Why do you think the reason behind that was? Like, why was there a need? Why was there a need, for example, for him to like push you that far that it would be painful?
I'm not sure there was a need. It was just his, he was just strong. He was a little bit aggressive, a bit angry sometimes. Entitled, perhaps, just you do it. That was it. You do. Don't argue. This is the way of the Guru. You do it. If you can't do it by yourself, I'm going to do it for you. And of course, if I had, if I had learnt or knew how to surrender properly to the adjustments, maybe I wouldn't have had those injuries or those pains. I don't know. Maybe it was my stubborn ego that was saying, no, I can't go there. This is too intense. But, it doesn't really matter whether I could have or not. The fact is, this is not a spiritual teaching. This is not an approach that is ethical or compassionate or considerate at all. This is a very aggressive and strong method, which I kind of thought I needed, We were all, I said before,
masochistic.
The punk generation. We were looking for catharsis. We thought pain was part of the process. We thought that, we had so much pain within us. And the other thing is, we had a lot of emotional pain. Everyone who was there pretty much had some kind of trauma, whether it was from childhood, whether they were drug addicts, whether they had injuries or their parents had just died in a car crash, whatever. Everyone came with a lot of pain. And so a lot of times, when you feel pain in the body, it's actually easier to deal with than the emotional pain that you're experiencing. So it's a way of transferring it onto another object. So it did feel, in a way, it felt sort of therapeutic in the sense that, it felt less. But as I said before, I feel that, I didn't say this explicitly, but I feel that the psychological transformations didn't really happen until much later. Some small psychological changes happened, but it really took a long time, and it took for me to stop being so aggressive with my body, with my practice, and being ambitious, and really learning to meditate, progressing to the next steps, pranayama, sitting more, and being more introspective, and thoughtful about what was going on with me. I don't think that, some people say that this asana practice is totally healing. I don't believe it. I don't buy it, actually. It's just the first step. And then these samskaras, the traumas, the stuff that's like in the unconscious, that has to be consciously confronted and healed, in my opinion. Because what happened when I started to sit is I would feel these pains in my body, things that I'd forgotten. And when I started meditating on those pains, all these childhood memories would come up. And, a lot of them I had already dealt with to some extent. But wherever there was a charge, wherever there had been like humiliation, wherever there had been anger, wherever there had been some negative experience, somehow I feel your body is like a canvas and your emotions are just painted on that body. To some extent, they become unconscious we have all this tension, like in the neck and shoulders, and throughout the whole body, the low back, and etc. I feel these are painted, on us throughout our various traumas that we experience in life. And as long as you're moving and breathing and stretching and all that, it's helping you to deal with the day-to-day, but it's not, from my experience, accessing those very, very deep samskaras, which only really arise when you are in total silence in your mind. You're trying to establish the silence, and then you become aware of the discomforts in your body, and those early memories start to percolate up. And then, you can ask yourself, am I still 5? Am I still really angry about this? Can I release this tension from my body through just breathing and recognizing that I'm not there anymore? I'm now a mature adult, and I have all these resources. So that was my experience, that the actual coming back to yoga, my early childhood experience, only happened after I'd been through the asana experience, through the pranayama experience, and then coming to a sitting practice, and really being quiet with myself and observing what was going on in a kind of intimate way, and gradually releasing all those things. That, in combination with going out into nature and feeling the release from being there, the two kind of combined, brought me back. So it really took me a long time. It took me a long time.
Did your other teacher have like a role? Did he play a role into this new level of awareness, into this like change?
Definitely. I think he's been giving me some very simple messages right from the beginning, but because the mind is so conditioned, it's very hard to put them into action. For instance, he told me, you don't need to do all these asanas. Try meditating. But still I was attached to this idea, I'm a Ashtanga teacher. I should practice what I teach. The potter's wheel keeps on spinning even after you take your foot off the wheel. Well, these days they're probably only electric wheels. But even if you turn off the power, the wheel still keeps spinning. There's, the bicycle keeps spinning after you stop pedaling. It takes some time before, after you've made the decision or come to a realization, for it to become real. So even though he'd been telling me for more than a decade, 45 minutes practice, asanas, enough. He said, you've got to practice every day. Your Vata constitution, you need to physically move to get that kind of stress out of your body. You make sure you take exercise every day, but you don't need to do 2 hours. You don't need to do the super advanced practice. Keep it simple and focus on sitting. And the attachment took a while to release.
Well, how is your practice now then?
Well, it's much more simple in my asana practice. Like I say, about 45 minutes or so. And then I spend as much time as I can sitting. Practice for me has always been svadhyaya as well. I love to study, so people always ask me, what do you do for the rest of your day? As much of the time as I can, I read. And for many years, I just read the Yoga Sutra, all the different commentaries and translations, and then learned the Sanskrit to translate it myself. And so I really meditated I didn't read anything else apart from Yoga Sutra for about a decade. Nothing.
That's a pretty big statement.
That's where I'm at too.
Yeah, it's a beautiful text. And then before and
what
after
else
that,
is there?
There's many other writings, of course, writings of Shankaracharya, the Upanishads, etc. But really, you don't need a lot of theory. Theory is pretty simple. Practice is what you need, but finding the practice that is right and that really works and is getting you to the right place, that's a hard thing because our minds are conditioned. We think we need something. We're kind of working on the memory of what we thought we needed, in the past, and that still keeps operating and functioning and driving you. and really knowing what is good for you a lot of times is quite hard to accept and put into practice.
I have a question for you. What was the process like of outgrowing Patabi Joyce? You know, the process of the movement from one teacher to the next.
You know, Patabi Joyce used to say, you should have only one guru.
Yeah.
And so for many years I was living with this kind of ambivalence of this kind of this dissonance in my mind. And then also when he gave me his blessing to teach, as that's what it used to be called back in 93,
Boop.
He made me promise. He said, you teach exactly what I taught you, and you keep coming back to Mysore. And when you make a promise to a guru, when you have a relationship with a guru, which, whether he was a true guru or not, of course, is a big question, or maybe not a question. But I regarded him to some extent as a guru. When you make that kind of promise, it's very, very hard to break. It's a relationship which is a bit like a marriage.
Yeah.
And then I became a teacher of Ashtanga Yoga, and so I felt also the obligation to continue to practice with him. I tried to escape from Mysore, but then he came to New York. Every year, for the first decade of my time in New York, he came to New York and taught workshops, and I had to turn up. And that was even worse because these were lead classes. And so I lived with a lot of dissonance for a long time. And I guess a big part of what I've been doing over these last 3 decades is, while still using that kind of form that I received from him, kind of giving it new content and releasing, like right from the beginning, I couldn't do exactly the way he taught me. For instance, those adjustments, which were sexually invasive, I now call them, I could not do. And then I also pushed students quite hard and hurt them in the beginning. That was the second thing I learned. I can't do that. So it was a gradual process of letting go, even though I still feel that I see it as a kind of template, a kind of beautiful system of progression, which should be applied differently according to different students, according to their needs, according to their bodies, their ages, etc., etc. So I still basically use the same system, but my approach to it is very, very different.
Wow.
I think there's probably quite a bit more to say about this, but I think we have to come to.
Yeah, I think we've had a pretty intense.
time, right?
Yeah, it's been quite a big journey. This episode.
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, it's been nice to get to know your personal experience into the practice. Hopefully, it can help others in their own. Well, guys, thank you. I'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.